The airline tried to stop her from escorting her fallen son. They made a big mistake. A grieving mother was almost denied her last moment of honor with her fallen son. By an airline? Solène stood at the gate, clutching a small worn photograph in one hand and a folded flag in the other. Her eyes were red, not just from the tears she had shed, but from the weight of heartbreak. Her son, Private First Class Nathan LaRue, had died serving his country overseas. Now, his body was coming home. Solène had just one wish: to escort her son's casket all the way home to Nebraska. It was the least she could do for the boy who once ran barefoot through their backyard, his arms outstretched like airplane wings, shouting commands to imaginary troops, dreaming of becoming a soldier. And he did. He became the man he always wanted to be. He served. He fought. He never came back. Now, in this sterile, humming airport terminal, Solène clutched a worn folder containing every official document she'd been told she'd need: death certificate, military escort authorization, flag presentation confirmation. Her hands trembled slightly as she approached the check-in counter, trailing the weight of immeasurable loss behind her like a shadow. The airline employee glanced at the papers, then looked up, their expression flattening. "Ma'am, this isn't enough," they said, eyes flicking to the next passenger in line. Solène blinked. I have everything they told me to bring. These are military documents. This is the escort authorization. That's my son. He's on the plane. I just want to be with him." Her voice broke, cracking under the strain of grief and exhaustion. The young man behind the counter didn't flinch. He looked at her the way someone looks at a delayed flight, an inconvenience. "A problem to be fixed. You'll need additional verification," he said flatly. "And someone will need to confirm your identity and relationship to the deceased." Solène's mouth opened, then closed. Her pulse rang in her ears. "He's my son," she whispered, the words thick with disbelief. "Please, this is his final journey." But the response was colder than the terminal air. The employee gave a small, uncomfortable shrug and pointed to a row of metal benches against the wall. "You'll need to wait over there while we sort this out." Solène's knees nearly buckled. She gathered her things slowly, carefully, as if she were handling something sacred. She walked to the seating area, sat down, and stared at nothing. She could still see the golden curls he had as a boy, could still remember the way his small hand would grab hers without asking. She had been the one to button his uniform the day he left. He said, "Don't cry, Mom. I'll come back." And now she was being told she needed more proof, more paperwork, more permission to grieve. A woman nearby glanced at her, then looked away. A child with a backpack sat cross-legged nearby, tapping on a tablet. Life went on, but for Solène, time stood still. She reached into her purse, pulled out a crumpled photograph, and stared at the image of her boy in uniform, smiling proudly. If only love counted for something in the systems that demanded only signatures and seals. All she wanted was to be with him, to see him home. Was that really too much to ask? Passengers nearby started to take notice. A few looked confused. Some were curious, but no one spoke up. Solène stood alone at the check-in counter, gripping her documents tighter, as if the paper itself might shield her from the rising storm of frustration and humiliation. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting cold shadows on the polished floor as her eyes searched the indifferent faces around her. She tried again, her voice cracking with a desperate mixture of sorrow and resolve. "I have military-issued papers, his photo. The Pentagon called your airline. I'm his escort." The airline staff, two uniformed attendants with tight smiles and nervous glances, exchanged a look before the one behind the counter responded, "I'm sorry, ma'am. Until we can verify this information through the system, there's nothing we can do." Verify? What more proof did they need? She had the official envelope marked with military insignia, the escort credentials, the signed letter, and the photo, God, the photo, of the man she had loved, served beside, and now had been assigned to bring home in a coffin draped in the flag they both believed in. She swallowed hard and took a shaky breath. He's a fallen soldier. I'm his escort. His wife is waiting for him in Washington. Please. The staff didn't budge. Their voices remained measured, professional, but hollow. We understand, but we must follow procedure. Minutes turned into nearly an hour. The terminal seemed to press in on her, the air heavy with silence and sidelong glances. Every tick of the airport clock above the gate seared deeper into her chest. Not just from the fresh wound of grief, but from something even more cutting. The quiet, sharp humiliation of being dismissed, doubted, and made invisible in the very moment when she had never felt more vulnerable or more resolute. She clenched, her jaw to keep the tears at bay. Crying would not help. Anger might. But she refused to let them see her break. Around her, the atmosphere began to shift. It started with a rustle, a suitcase being nudged aside, a seat creaking. Then, from a quiet corner near the charging station, a man in a business suit stood. His gray hair was neatly combed. His tie loosened from what had clearly been a long day, but his eyes were sharp and kind. He stepped forward. "I'm a veteran," he said, his voice steady and low, "and I know disrespect when I see it." The words hung in the air like a match struck in darkness. Heads turned. Someone lowered their coffee. A couple that had been arguing near a vending machine stopped mid-sentence. Solène looked up, startled by the voice. And what followed? More people gathered. Whispers turned into murmurs. Some took out their phones. The moment was no longer private. It was becoming public. Another man joined. Then a woman in scrubs said softly, "My brother didn't come home from Iraq. We shouldn't treat people like this." The veteran moved closer to the counter, his tone still calm, but now tinged with righteous weight. "This woman is escorting a fallen soldier. She's not asking for an upgrade. She's not asking for a favor. She's doing a duty most of us would never have the strength to face. This delay, this questioning, it's not just red tape. It's an insult." One of the airline staff shifted uncomfortably. The other reached for a phone. A manager approached, sensing the shift in energy, perhaps alerted by the crowd forming or a silent warning from security. "I'll take care of this," the manager said quickly. "Ma'am, may I see those papers again?" Solène handed them, over with trembling hands. This time the documents were examined with greater care, greater respect. The manager nodded, whispered something to the staff, then looked up and met her eyes. "I'm truly sorry, Ms. Leclerc. Everything is in order. We'll take you to the gate now." She nodded, unable to find words. A breath escaped her lips, a release of tension she hadn't realized she'd been holding. As she was led toward the secure area, the crowd parted for her. A few people saluted. Others placed hands over their hearts. The man in the business suit gave her a small nod of respect. She didn't say thank you. She couldn't. Not yet. But her eyes said everything. And as the gate doors closed behind her, silence settled once more in the terminal. But it was no longer indifferent. It was reverent. Then, a voice rang out over the terminal loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, Flight 723 to Omaha is delayed. We apologize for the inconvenience." A collective groan echoed through the terminal. People glanced up from their phones, glanced at their watches, and exchanged impatient murmurs. Businessmen sighed. Parents shuffled children to keep them entertained. But quickly, the murmurs shifted from frustration to confusion. "Why is it delayed? What's going on?" Terminal staff didn't answer, and that's when another voice rose. This time, not from a speaker, but from a man in a worn bomber jacket, eyes red-rimmed, voice trembling with restrained fury. He stepped beside Solène and pointed toward her, gently, almost reverently. "This woman is trying to take her son, an American soldier, home," he said, voice cracking, "and they won't let her." A hush fell. A wave of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Gasps, sharp and collective, pierced the air. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Footsteps paused. The clinking of coffee cups went silent. Someone near. The gate began filming. Another voice, sharper now, shouted, "What do you mean they won't let her through? Is this true?" "She's a Gold Star mother," cried out a young woman near the charging station. "You don't treat someone like that." People started rising from their seats, not in chaos, but in something closer to purpose. Questions flew like sparks. Where's your supervisor? Why isn't she already on the plane? You're holding up a soldier's escort? The airline staff fumbled. The earlier confidence on their faces melted into panic. One tried to speak, into a radio. Another moved toward the back office. But the crowd was no longer passive. It was rising. In the eye of the storm stood Selene. She hadn't moved. Couldn't move. Her legs felt like stone, and yet she was trembling. The photo of her son, a young man in full dress uniform, eyes shining, with the same stubborn fire she'd always admired, was clenched tightly in her hand, the edges of the paper curling under her fingers. Tears streamed down her face, unashamed and unhidden. She didn't wipe them away, because this wasn't just about a flight anymore. This was about dignity. This was about respect. This was about a mother's final goodbye. She had buried her grief under layers of duty. She had carried her sorrow through airports and security checkpoints, through military bases and empty hotel rooms. She had remained composed when the flag was folded and handed to her. She had stayed silent when the system failed to acknowledge her role. But now the world was watching, and in the presence of that growing crowd, her silence spoke louder than any protest. A little girl tugged her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Why is that lady crying?" "She's a hero," the mother replied, voice thick, "because her son was one." The man who had spoken up earlier stepped forward again. He raised his phone and turned to the crowd. "She's not asking for anything special. She's not looking for attention. She just wants to take her son home, that's all. And this airline is holding her up because of protocol. Are we okay with that?" The crowd answered with a thunderous no. A pilot, off-duty in uniform, walking through the terminal, heard the commotion and made his way toward the counter. After a hushed exchange with the manager, he nodded solemnly and stepped beside Selene. "I'll escort her myself," he said. "On my wings. No one delays a Gold Star mother under my watch." The manager finally addressed the crowd, his face pale. "We apologize. It was a mistake. She'll be escorted through immediately." A path opened. As Selene walked toward the gate, she was no longer alone. Dozens stood in quiet solidarity, some saluting, some bowing their heads. Others wiped their own tears. Phones were lowered. This wasn't a moment to record anymore. It was a moment to honor. At the gate door, Selene turned once more, holding up her son's photo, not for herself, but for them. For everyone who finally saw not just a grieving mother, but the sacred weight of sacrifice. And as she passed through, the crowd stood still. Silent, united, not in protest or outrage, but in reverence. The pressure was building. A quiet hum turned into whispers. Whispers turned into murmurs. People were no longer just standing by. They were witnessing something that didn't feel right, and no one could look away. Selene stood alone in the center of the terminal, a folded American flag in her arms, a photograph of her son pressed to her chest. Her hands were shaking, but her feet stayed firm. She had faced bigger pain than this. She had buried it deep for the flight ahead. But now, that pain was being replaced by something else. Disrespect, confusion, anger. It had been nearly an hour since the airline first stopped her, questioning her identity, her documents, even the story behind why she was flying with a military escort tag. She had shown them everything: official letters from the Department of Defense, identification, and a certificate confirming her son's remains were being flown home. Yet somehow they told her, "We still need to verify." That's when it happened. A supervisor, clearly alerted by the rising tension, rushed over. His face was full of urgency, his eyes darting between the crowd, the airline staff, and Selene. He stepped forward. "Ma'am," he said, out of breath, "may I see your documents?" Selene didn't speak. She simply handed them over with trembling fingers. The man quickly scanned them, page after page, and then his expression changed. First, confusion, then shock, then guilt. His lips parted as if to say something, but he paused. The realization had hit him like a ton of bricks. This woman should have never been stopped, never been questioned, never made to wait alone in the middle of a terminal, her heart shattered and dignity questioned. He looked up at her and said softly, "This should never have happened." But it was already too late. By now, several people had started recording. Others stood silently, watching every move. Some even wiped tears from their eyes. You could feel the weight of the moment hanging in the air like a storm cloud, thick with unspoken emotion. The supervisor cleared his throat. "On behalf of the airline, I want to personally apologize," he said loudly, for everyone to hear. "We will upgrade your seat. We will escort you personally." But Solène didn't care about upgrades or comfort. Her voice, calm but fierce, cut through the noise like a blade. "I didn't come here for comfort," she said. "I came to take my son home." And with that, the terminal fell into a deep, heavy silence, not the awkward kind, the sacred kind. A pause in time where everyone suddenly understood. This wasn't just a traveler. This wasn't just a mother. This was a warrior of love, carrying the weight of loss that few could ever imagine. And the people responded. A man in uniform stood up and saluted her. A child clutched his father's hand and asked in a whisper, "Daddy, is she a hero?" The crowd around her slowly began to clap. Not for the airline, not for the apology, but for her strength, for her patience, for her silence that spoke louder than words. Solène was gently guided to the gate, and this time, no one dared stop her. Not a single eye looked away as she walked. Her steps were slow, but every one of them carried the memory of her son. Heads bowed, hands went over hearts. Some passengers cried openly. She passed through the boarding gate not as a woman, but as a symbol of sacrifice, of motherhood, of resilience. She took her seat on the plane, but her journey wasn't just about reaching a destination. It was about honoring a promise to stand beside her son in life and even now, in death. When the plane lifted off the runway, somewhere far behind in that terminal, hearts were still heavy. People weren't just catching flights that day. They were catching perspective. And later that evening, when the video clips surfaced, online, clips of Solène standing strong, of strangers clapping, of a nation pausing, everything changed. The airline issued a formal apology not just in private, but publicly. They promised to revise their policies for military families. And Solène? She didn't want attention. She didn't want pity. All she ever wanted was simple, to walk her son home. The video went viral. By nightfall, it wasn't just a trending clip. It was a movement. Within hours, Solène's story had spread across every major social media platform. TikTok. Users were stitching her moment of silence. Instagram Reels replayed the slow walk through the terminal as people bowed their heads. On X, formerly Twitter, hashtags like "Ach honor her son," "Ach Gold Star mother," and "We stand with Solène" began trending worldwide. It wasn't just civilians who shared the video. News anchors opened their broadcasts with her story. Cable networks aired segments, showing the moment the crowd applauded her, slowed down to emphasize the power in her silence. Military families from every corner of the country shared their own stories of traveling with fallen loved ones, stories of similar pain and sometimes similar mistreatment. For them, Solène's strength became their voice. Even celebrities joined the conversation. Some tweeted simple messages of support. Others went further, pledging donations to military support organizations and calling out the lack of empathy in airline systems. And then came the moment the airline released a formal statement, not just on their website, but live during a press conference. They didn't just apologize to Solène. They apologized to every Gold Star family. They promised a complete review of their protocol, new staff training programs, and immediate changes to how military escorts are handled. But for Solène, none of this was about going viral. Her purpose was never to make headlines. She just wanted one thing, to honor her son. And when she finally arrived in Nebraska, that's exactly what happened. As the plane touched down, a small town, usually quiet, usually unnoticed, was ready. The runway was lined with people. Flags waved in the wind. Some so large they needed 2 people to hold them. Children in school uniforms saluted as the casket was carefully removed. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, medals on their jackets, heads bowed low. It was more than a funeral. It was a tribute. Tribute to a son who gave his life for something bigger. A tribute to a mother who refused to let that life be treated like an afterthought. The funeral procession made its way through the town slowly. Businesses closed their doors in silent respect. People lined the sidewalks, hands over hearts, many in tears, not just for Solène, but for every soldier who never made it home. When the casket was finally lowered into the ground, Solène stood still, holding back her tears. Not because she had none left, but because she had finally fulfilled her duty. She had walked her son home, and as she looked at the sea of people, friends, strangers, supporters, she realized something. Her son's sacrifice had done more than protect a nation. It had reminded it of honor, reminded it of empathy, reminded it that sometimes all it takes is one mother's silent strength to make an entire country listen. If this story touched your heart, don't scroll away. Honor Solène. Honor every mother who's had to say goodbye far too soon. Comment your thoughts below, and share this video to make sure no Gold Star family ever gets treated this way again. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, real-life stories.